Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So today we'll cover chapter 2 of the textbook on modern monetary theory. So there are 4 learning objectives listed at the beginning of the chapter. One is to learn about the fallacy of composition. This just means that if something is good for the individual, it may not be good for the whole group. And basically the kind of logic that works at the level of the household is not the same as the one which works at the level of the nation as a whole. So that's the fallacy of composition. We also call that complexity theory. And complexity just means, as a technical term, that the behavior of the group cannot be reduced to the behavior of the part. The sum of the parts is not equal to the whole. Macroeconomics, the second learning objective, is that this is a highly contested discipline. There are many different schools of thought and they have very different ideas about how we should manage economic policy, and they are always fighting each other because a lot depends on the policy taken. All policies help some groups and hurt others, so each group has some interest in that kind of policy that is adopted. The third objective is to learn some stylized facts. What is a stylized fact? Well, facts are, of course, facts. Like there are so many people in Pakistan. A stylized fact is something which is sort of a pattern that you see within a fact. A collection of facts which form a pattern. So this pattern may not be perfectly there in the facts. For example, you might say that in general growth has been increasing, but there might be a case in which this didn't happen. So this is not really true as a fact because it didn't happen, but it's sort of a pattern. And the final objective is to develop critical thinking skills about the working of a macro with its own sovereign currency, which means that basically you should learn to think on your own instead of accepting traditional wisdom, things which are being said in newspapers or written in textbooks. So to start with, we think about the fallacy of composition, and this leads to mistakes which are made both in the common press and also by professional economists. So, for example, the most common example is that the government budget is like the household budget and we must eventually balance this budget. So now if you look at the US debt, it has been constantly increasing and increases by $1 trillion every year. So how can we say that? And when will the time come to pay this back? Actually, never. And it doesn't need to be ever paid back. Unlike the household debt, where if you keep running a major deficit every month, eventually people will start say that where are we going to see this money? And so they will stop giving you credit, and then you will have a collapse if you are borrowing and you are living on borrowed money. But the governments are not like that because the governments can print money. And this is just for the US, but nearly every country in the world has been running deficits, and these deficits have been increasing, and nobody has So this idea that there is a sustainable level of debt, and if the debt increases too much, that causes problems, this is not supported by the data. So basically, things that we think of as individuals, that in my house, how much money I earn, how much I spend on groceries, and how much I spend on transport and education, and trying to figure out how to make the budget balance. These are household concepts, but they don't apply at the government level. The government can pay off any amount of debt by just printing the money and paying. Saving money for tomorrow is useless, is a meaningless concept, because saving money just means printing money. You print money now, or you can print money later. So if you save money now to use it for the future, it's a meaningless operation. Now, if the government nonetheless tries to reduce its deficit, then because of the sectoral balance, when the government has smaller deficit, then the private sector has smaller surplus. This makes the income earned by the private sector go down, and this will mean that the taxes might also go down, so that the deficit might not actually come down. So attempts to reduce the deficit might actually end up increasing the deficit. So this was one of the key contributions of Keynes, and basically pre-Keynesian macroeconomics was exactly this, that we just analyze the economy at the level of the individuals, and whatever happens we just multiply that by the number. So if one individual and there are 100,000, then you can get the macro picture by just multiplying it up, scaling it up. So basically the main contribution of Keynes was to say that no, macro must be done separately, because what happens at the group level is not exactly what happens at the individual level. So one of the key contributions of Keynes was that he showed in many cases that what happens at the individual level doesn't happen at the macro level. So one very simple example is, one person decides to save money while others do not, then he will achieve his goal, and it will have the consequence that he wants to be able to buy more things tomorrow and less today. So if one person does that, there is no problem, he will succeed in doing that. But if everybody is trying to do that, then there is a serious problem. If everybody is trying to save for tomorrow, what will happen is that the demand for goods being produced today will go down by a lot, and seeing that the demand is less, the factories will cut back production. And they will not do investment, so there will be much less good available tomorrow. Also, the incomes will become very much reduced, because there are no jobs, because nobody is producing anything. So in fact, the attempt by everybody to save might end up doing the reverse. That is, with less income you will not be able to save as much. Now, so a lot of things in trying to decide whether there is this effect or not, there are a lot of things which matter, like if one individual is trying to save, why is he trying to save? Is everybody else trying to save? Do they all know whether the other people are also trying to save? All of these things, which are sort of micro details, matter, and they make a difference, and different outcomes could result depending on the state of knowledge. Now, the traditional today's macro models the DSGE model avoids and bypasses this problem by using the concept of the representative agent. So there is one agent which represents all the agents, and then you just scale it up to get your economy. So this is just basically it's the ostrich mode, where you bury your head in the sand to avoid looking at the problem. Both Keynes and Marx attacked the fallacy of composition, but the general economists are, let's say, intelligence challenged and cannot understand this simple point. So some examples of the fallacy is that if one person stands up in a crowd in the stadium to see what's happening better, he will succeed. He will be able to see better. But if everybody stands up, then this will not work. Similarly, suppose there are 500 jobs and there are 1,000 unemployed people. So one person, he says the technique for getting a job is to rise up early, go to a lot of jobs, make a better vita, and so on, and learn interview skills, etc. All of this matters and all of this will work. But if everybody does this, then there are only 500 jobs. 500 people will still remain unemployed. So something which is true at the individual level is not true at the group level. So there are two major examples of the fallacy of composition in Keynes. One is, of course, the paradox of thrift, which we have already discussed. If one person tries to save, that's a different thing. And if everybody is trying to save, that leads to drop in aggregate demand, which has dramatically different effects and might end up reducing saving. Similarly, we've already discussed this, that if the nominal wages are reduced, that allows the firms to hire more people. So technically, that might be a solution for unemployment. But as we have seen, and as Keynes says, the bargain between a firm and the laborer does not determine the real wage. And if we look at what's happening in the whole economy, if the wages overall are going down, then the firm's cost of productions are going down. So whatever pricing rule they use, they will reduce the price of the output, and so the real wage may not change, or it may go up, or it may go down. And so the solution to the unemployment would not occur in that situation. So the basic causal sequence that demand side macroeconomics, and this is also the point of view of modern monetary theory, is that it's spending, and spending is basically aggregate effective demand. Aggregate demand is just the desire to spend, and but the desire to spend may be frustrated for a number of reasons. Person may want to spend, may not have money, may not have a job, etc. So the amount of spending that is actually being done, that is what signals people to produce. And when the people produce, in the process of production, jobs are created, so employment is affected, income is produced, and this income which comes from the jobs is also used to spend. So that's a sort of a cyclical process. Now, so this is demand side economy, but the basically driver of the process is spending. Now, because of this cyclical process, you can imagine that the process starts with the production. So, and this is what supply side economics is. First, the production decisions are made, that leads to jobs and income, and that leads to the spending decisions. So if this is the causal sequence, then a dramatically different picture of the world emerges. And so one of the goals of this chapter also, and later also, there is to distinguish between these two possibilities. So after the global financial crisis occurred, there was the attempt to improve the conditions by following what is called austerity, balancing the budget, export promotion, and all of these are actually the wrong kinds of policies. They are based on the household analogy, that if a household is in financial crisis, what will you do? You tighten your budget, you try to increase your income, you try to decrease your expenses. So people think that the same theory would work at the national level, but this is not true. At the national level, the opposite happens, that when you're in a crisis, you should spend more, reduce your earnings, exactly the opposite of what one would do in a household. Because of the fact that the government deficit is the private surplus. So if the private sector is in crisis, you increase your deficit, you will increase the private sector surplus. So what is the subject of macro all about? Basically, we should be able to tell what policy I should adopt. Should I be increasing taxes? Should I be increasing my deficit? The forecasting aspect is not very important, in the sense that the world is random. So as long as I know that at this point increasing taxes is a bad idea, so I reduce taxes. Can I calculate the effect of this action? No, I cannot, because a lot of other things are happening at the same time. But as long as I know that lowering taxes is a good thing, that's enough to make the policy. Because so forecasting, unlike, you see, the standard conventional economic theory says that the only test of a theory and the goal of economics is to do forecasting. And so a model is valid if it produces good forecasts, and it's not if it doesn't. So, as I said, our goal is to understand the causal mechanisms, and as long as we understand the causal mechanisms, we don't have to, any forecasting is not greatly important. But if there are really very serious mistakes in terms of what we see in the world and what our model says, then that suggests that there's something wrong with our model. So for example, if our model predicts that the global financial crisis cannot happen, and it happens, then we should rethink the model. The stylized facts that we will now go into are very useful in two ways. One of them is that when we look at in general what has been happening, then we want to construct a model which produces those stylized facts. That's a reality check on the model, that if the model roughly matches what we see in the world, then the model is probably correct. And a reasonable theory, and also these things give us the goal, that what our theory should be able to do. Our theory should be able to explain what we see in the world. So this is the place where good theorizing starts, and this is very different from your conventional macro course, which doesn't take any look at reality. What the conventional macro course does is it starts by axioms and definitions and mathematics, and does not actually look at what's happening in the real world. Once you have your whole theory, then you look around the world to see if there is something you can find which will match what your model is saying, and then you take that as proof. So this is exactly the opposite of the model. I mean your model in the conventional methodology is automatically proven because you start with definitions and axioms which are all true. So there is never any question of trying to see if the theory works or not. The theory is known to be true. If the facts disagree with it, the facts are wrong. Alright, so now we look at some stylized facts. These are facts about the global economies: Australia, Germany, Italy, Japan, Spain. Now, since this is the first time I'm teaching this course, so I'm just following the textbook. But the second time, I would try to bring in the relevant facts about Pakistan and put them in and see if we can work with them. But right now I'm trying to learn the subject, so I don't have time to actually go and apply this. So basically this says that, you see, in the period 60 to 70, we had pretty high growth rates everywhere. But so there was 4.5, 5.7, 10% in Japan, 9% in Spain. UK was not too good, 3%, and US was doing nearly 5%. But since the 70s, the growth has slowed down everywhere. European notions have performed poorly, and especially since 2000, the European countries haven't done well, but Australia has done better relative to the European countries. So these are the stylized facts. Now, from these facts, we get some questions that why has real GDP growth become slower? Why was it high in the 60s, and why did it become slower afterwards? And why is Australia doing better than Germany and Italy? And why did Italy and Spain do very badly in the 2010 to 15 period? Does anybody know? Why did Italy and Spain have negative growth in?
So, in the international financial crisis, I think there was a debt crisis in Europe all over.
Yeah.
And although Greek was the most hard-hit country, but Italy, Spain, I think they were also given a bit of labor.
Yeah, that's correct. Basically, the global financial crisis hit Europe and USA pretty hard. It didn't hit Australia and Asia as hard as the rest. Also, the appropriate response to the crisis would have been designed in terms of monetary policy, but because the euro creates a common currency for the European Union, so the weaker countries were unable to pursue appropriate monetary policy. Monetary policy was basically decided by Germany, which was the biggest country and most powerful. And so whatever policy was dictated for Europe, everybody had to follow because they don't have independent money. And so the weak economies took a bad hit, because basically when you're in a crisis, what you need to do is to expand and run a deficit and print money, but they were unable to do so. So these are unemployment rates. Australia and Germany and Italy are in the top line. In general, one thing is that the unemployment has been increasing since the 60s, silly, right? So, between 1960 to 1980, unemployment is low in all of these countries. But since then, since the 1980s, unemployment has increased quite a lot. It has also fluctuated quite a lot. So these are the so-called business cycles. In Australia, things have been fairly good. Since 1995, the unemployment has come down. Germany also, in the recent era, the unemployment has gone down, but Italy, after the global financial crisis, unemployment has been going up. Japan is doing fairly well. The scales are different. In Australia, Germany, and Italy, you have 12%, and 14% is the maximum. But in Japan, the 6% is the top of the line. And in Spain, it's 30%. It's really huge. And Spain has really been doing very badly with the unemployment rate near 25%. The UK has been doing not too badly post global financial crisis. These are the same numbers in a chart that was presented graphically. So just copying from the textbook. So if you have a macroeconomic model, the job of the macroeconomic model is not to teach students how to do differential calculus, but to explain how, why these things happened. So that's what the importance of the stylized facts is, that these are the facts, and now we need to build a model which explains why we see these facts. How was unemployment kept at low levels during the 50s and 60s? Why did they rise? Why are these business cycles? Why does unemployment fluctuate, sometimes going up, sometimes going down? What's the relationship between growth and unemployment? And so on. So when it comes to trying to explain, there is the famous Keynes versus Chicago school, supply side versus demand side, neoliberals versus orthodox versus heterodox economics, and so on. So basically, the modern monetary theory says that the total spending is the key variable which determines the output and employment, and also unemployment. So basically what we need to do is to figure out, why did the aggregate demand vary? Why did the aggregate demand increase? Why did it change? How does it behave? And from this key variable, everything else will be determined. So that's the source. So that's what we need to study if we follow MMT. As opposed to this, the supply siders think of the production as your basic. So they look at the inputs to the production process. If somehow capital is pretty fixed, but increase in capital is governed by investment, so is there a reason why investment is going up or down? That's the capital side. And the other part is labor. If the laborers decide not to work for some reason, then that resource will be reduced, and so production will go down. So basically the supply siders say that it's the supply factors, the supply of available capital and labor, which determines the output, and then everything else follows from there. So if you have high unemployment, this is because people don't want to work. So they quit their jobs and they enjoy leisure. And somebody said that the Great Depression was actually the Great Vacation, where everybody just decided not to work and to enjoy their leisure. So what we have in trying to decide between these is indirect empirical evidence. You see, basically, this is why supply side economics keeps going, because as I've explained, at the observable level, the action is all unobservable. Why are people not working? Is it because they are enjoying their leisure, or is it because they can't find a job? So that's something that's inside the heart, and you can't. You can only find indirect evidence which supports one side, but you can never convincingly. If somebody says that this wall is blue, then we can have consensus because it's observable. But if somebody said that this wall has been filled with the wrong kind of concrete, and the sand to concrete ratio is high, then we can't determine that. But we can maybe knock a hole, and if the wall falls down, then we say probably you're right. But again, that's indirect evidence. So basically, when you are studying economics, you only have indirect evidence. And that's why very bad theories can survive, because you don't have direct observational level evidence. Although you can have very strong indirect evidence. So, if you are a supply-sider, the textbook says, then you have to explain why in 2008, when the global financial crisis occurred, the unemployment rose very rapidly and dramatically in 4 of the countries which were most heavily affected, and not in Australia and Japan. So, presumably, the reason that the unemployment rose is that people suddenly decided that they didn't want to work. So, if that was the case, then you would see that quit rates are high, and quit rates are some things that you can measure. People just leave their jobs for some reason. It could be also retirement, but so when people leave jobs, then the labor supply goes down. So now a general stylized fact is that quit rates are pro-cyclical. In the business cycle, when the economy is booming, then people have high quit rates, and when the economy is going down, and that's because when there are lots of jobs around, when the economy is booming, then the people move and try to find better jobs from. And when the economy is doing badly, then people stay at their current jobs because they do not. So the quit rates are low. So in the global financial crisis, there was a recession in all the economies and the big economies. And so in a recession, you wouldn't see quit rates going up, you would see quit rates going down. So the unemployment that resulted could not be from people deciding not to work, because if it was people deciding not to work, then it would show up in the quit rates, and the quit rates don't behave in that way. So this means that a demand side explanation of variations is more plausible than the supply side. As you can see, the text, this is just copied from the text. Text doesn't say that this proves the demand side, because this is just indirect evidence. Writing some time ago, Nicholas Kaldor gave 6 stylized facts, 6 general facts about the advanced economies, the rich economies, of these, one of these facts is that the share of wages and the share of profits has been roughly constant. In the USA, it was since the second half of the 19th century, so from 1950 to about 1980, the share of labor in national output was around 75%, and the share of capital was around 25%. Now, we will show later that if the labor share is constant, it means that the real wage should be aligned with the productivity of labor. Now, this is the graph for Australia, but we've also shown similar graphs to you for global economies as well. So the real wage is the blue line, and these two were roughly matched up until about 1980. So this confirms the Kaldor's stylized facts that since between 1950 and 1980, the real wage and the productivity were more or less aligned, but since 1980, there has been a deviation. The real wage has remained low, but the productivity has gone up. And correspondingly, the share of labor in the national output has gone down, and the share of capital has increased. So there is a gap between real wage and labor productivity, which means that there is a redistribution of real income. The financiers and the capitalists are capturing much more of the output, and the laborers are getting much less. In Australia, the wage share dropped from 60% to around 52%. So how can we explain this shift in the shares? Why did Kaldor's stylized facts end in 1980? And what is going to be the consequence of this dramatic redistribution of wealth away from labor and into the hands of the capitalists? And so on. So one of the key factors that we will see is useful to explain these is the household debt to income ratio. So you can see that in 1988 it was around 60%, but in 2015 it has gone to about 180%. So people owe more than they earn. One of the reasons for this is the credit card and the expansion of the financial lobby, which is willing to give loans freely to everybody. So people borrow to finance the education of their children, people borrow for this, that and the other, borrow to buy houses, is big. So the amount of borrowing is much higher. So the questions which arise from looking at this graph: why is this increase happening, and does this have something to do with the shift in the share of capital, in the share of labor, the decline in the share of income going to the laborers, and the increase in the share of wealth going to the capitalists? And does this have anything to do with the global financial crisis? Here is another useful stylized fact. This is the monetary base. This is also called high-powered money. Now, in your conventional macro test, you get definitions and you don't get the data. High-powered money, basically this is currency in circulation plus any deposits that the banks hold at the Federal Reserve or the central bank, which is actually required by law that every bank must have keep a certain amount of money at the Federal Reserve. So the common thread here is that these are the liabilities of the Federal Reserve Bank. That cash in principle is an IOU is a debt of the Federal Bank, which the Federal Bank has to redeem for gold. Today, this is meaningless. And if you look at the rupiah, it says "Hamile haza ko ek rupiah ada karegi," which sort of doesn't make much sense because you already have the rupiah. But anyway, so the base is that, and also the deposits that the banks have at the central bank, these are also liabilities of the Federal Reserve. So the money owed by the Federal Reserve Bank is the high-powered currency. And you can see that it has been going up smoothly up until 2009. What happened in 2009? Why was there this sudden jump? Global financial crisis occurred, but that's not going to cause a dramatic increase in reserves. Yes. Who said that? Yes. Basically, Friedman's analysis of the Great Depression was that it was caused by the mistakes made by the Federal Reserve, and in particular, he said that the mistakes led to a dramatic contraction in the money supply, and that was what caused to the Great Depression. So this time, Bernanke said that yes, you were right, Friedman, and we're not going to let it happen again, and he pushed in trillions of dollars into the monetary system, but that did not prevent the Great Recession, showing that the Friedman's analysis was wrong. It was not just it was not just mistaken monetary policy. This quantitative easing is the first time that such an experiment has been tried in printing trillions. It did not have the did not have the effects that economists thought that it would. Neither the Chicago school side nor the Keynesians, neither of them correctly anticipated what would happen. So why did this happen? In January 2008, the US monetary base was $830 billion, a little below 1 trillion. It accelerated upwards very quickly to, it was about, this is slightly under 1 trillion, and it went up to 3.8 trillion, basically quadrupling. So many mainstream economists predicted that this would lead to a very huge expansion in the money, and because basically if you apply the standard theory which you have been taught about multiplier effects, then all of this money would be translated into, multiplied by a certain number, because this is high-powered money, and would become money floating in the economy, and this would translate to massive inflation. But nothing like that happened. In fact, inflation remained quite low. So basically the standard theories about how does the monetary base relate to the money supply have been proven false. And the issue is that these are all liabilities of the central bank. So is it true that the ability of the central bank, you see, previously and today we are told that the government cannot print money because it was called inflation. This is exactly Yani this is exactly the government printing a lot of money and not causing inflation. So there is a paper by the Governor Daniel Tarullo, who was governor of Federal Reserve for 5 years, and he says running monetary policy without a working theory of inflation. This is the title of the paper, and he says describes the experience that all of the theories of inflation that we know have all failed. So now the question is, how do you run monetary policy when the goal is to control inflation, when you don't know what causes inflation? So these are 5 propositions from conventional macroeconomics which are widely believed. One of them is that if you have persistent fiscal deficits, then the short-term interest rates will go up. Why? Because when government runs deficit, then it will try to finance this by borrowing from the banks, and so when it borrows, then this will drive up the interest rates, the cost of borrowing. When you have high interest rates, then the private investment will be reduced because people cannot borrow to finance their investments. This is called crowding out. And if you keep running these fiscal deficits, then you one of the ways, the standard ways that the government finances it is to sell treasury bonds. The Pakistan government also sells bonds, and in the past Pakistan government has had trouble in selling bonds because the yield that they are offering, the market wants to get higher yields, and so they don't buy. So the sale is offered, but there is no, the supply is there, but there is no demand. So if the private sector is not willing to lend to the government, then the sources of finance for the government will drive up, and the government will run out of money. And another effect of fiscal deficits is that a lot of money will be pumped into the economy because the government finances its deficit by printing money, and this will lead to inflation, and this is very harmful to the macroeconomy. So these are some of the standard propositions which are widely believed and are used to make policy. So the textbook concludes with a case study of Japan. Let's look at how these things work in Japan. So here is the government fiscal balance from 1980 to 2015. So the blue lines are the deficits, and as you can see that from the period 1988 to 1992 roughly, the government ran a surplus, that is the red, but since then, since 1992 or 1993, the government has been running fairly high deficits. As a percent of GDP, you can see that the deficit is about 10% of the GDP in 2008 and 6% in 2014. So these are the fiscal balances of Japan. And because the government has been running deficits, so the debt of the government has been rising. The blue is the gross debt, and the net is the, when you subtract the assets of the government. So in either case, regardless of whether you look at the net or the gross, the net debt is now about greater than 100% of the GDP, and the gross debt is closer to 250%. It's very high, and it has been increasing since 1992, as one would expect. However, so what should have happened that because the government is borrowing a lot, so the interest rate should rise. But here's the central bank interest rate. Since 1995, it has been going down, and it has been virtually very close to zero. So 0.5% or something like that. So even though deficit has been high and increasing, the interest rate which is offered by the government has not been increasing, contrary to standard theory. Here is the yield on 10-year government bonds. This is the long-term interest rate, not the short-term interest rate. This is what the government tries to sell. Now, the Pakistan government has been unable to sell the long-term bonds. There has been no demand for it. Short-run bonds they have been able to sell, but basically the reason that the government has been unable to sell long-run bonds is that the market believes that the interest rates are going up. So if you lock yourself into a slow interest rate for a long period, this would be harmful. If the market believes interest rates are going down, then they would be willing to buy long-term bonds. So in Pakistan this has not happened, but here in Japan the long-term bond yields have been going down over the same period of time. So it is not that the government has had to increase the interest rates in order to make their bonds attractive to buy. So the demand for bonds remains high and the yields remain low, even though there has been increasing fiscal deficit. Now, one of the things that happens when you have increasing fiscal deficit is that the people think that the government is going to run into a crisis, it's going to be unable to pay. So because of that, they demand higher risk premium. But nothing like that is evident from the Japanese data. Similarly, if the government runs deficit, this should lead to inflation, but we find that the inflation has been very much controlled. Actually, since 1998 onwards, you see more deflation, which is a reduction in prices. So again, the standard macro theory does not explain these facts. So what do we conclude from this case study? That despite persistent deficits and rising public debt to GDP ratio, and even Japan's credit rating was downgraded by international ratings, there is no the central bank has not been forced to increase interest to borrow money, and the Japanese government has not continues to sell long-term bonds at low interest rates, and there has not been inflation. Alright, so basically we covered some of the major macroeconomic events that have been going on in the real world, and our goal will be to build a theory which can explain these events.